Amen. For all of you who didn't clap there, I'm getting ready to preach to you. Preaching to you non-clappers. Seriously, we're in this sermon series titled The Battles That We Fight, and today my sermon title is The Battle for Worship. Battle for Worship. We talk about a lot of different battles, and you wouldn't think that worship would be a battle. You really, we worship God. How is that a battle? To sing the songs or clap our hands or to raise our hands and worship, how is that a battle? And the reality is that you and I do go through seasons where we find it very difficult at times to worship God. We find it difficult to say thank you. We find it difficult to express our appreciation to who God is, to acknowledge who He is in spite of what's going on around us. Because God doesn't change. And His value of worship doesn't go up and down based on what's happened in my life. His value of worship is based on who He is. And since He is a God who sits on the throne of heaven, and He is everywhere all the time, sees everything, knows everything, and has always been who He is and never will be diminished, because He's provided salvation for us, because He is our Creator, because of all those things, He is worthy of our worship on my best days, and He's worthy of my worship on my worst days. We serve a God who is worthy of our worship. But there are times that we feel it difficult. Yeah, there are Sundays where we come in here and everything is great. Like you got a promotion, you got a pay raise, your spouse is being nice to you, you ate all the food that you wanted to eat and you still lost weight. It's just been an incredible week. You had a Saturday that was just perfect. You come in here and Caleb and the worship team have picked all the right songs. And everything is just hitting the right note. And it is so easy to just love God and to worship Him and to tell everybody how good God is. But that's not always the case. There are weeks where you didn't get the promotion. You were overlooked and maybe even got a demotion. And your truck broke down and spent another 3 weeks in the shop. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And your wife is upset at you, and the kids haven't been doing what they're supposed to be doing, and your health seems to be falling apart, and everything in your life seems to be just on the wrong tracks. You feel like you're just grinding to exist. And even on those days, we should still be people who worship. And that's why there are times you have to fight for worship. You have to fight for it because you don't feel like doing it. We see this in the Bible. In the Old Testament, if you're new to the Bible, there's a story about a guy named Job in the Old Testament. In fact, there's a whole book about him, 40 chapters about Job. And the way the story begins is very interesting. Satan goes to heaven. God's having a meeting up in heaven, and Satan shows up to the meeting. And God says, "What have you been doing?" And Satan says, "I've been looking for someone to destroy, someone's life to wreck." Now, you would think that at this point, God would just say, "No, you're not going to be allowed to do that." But God doesn't. God says, "Well, have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan says, "Well, I have, but you have protected him, and so I haven't been able to wreck his life. But if you'll let me wreck his life, he will turn his back on you, and he will not serve you." So God says, "Okay, you can touch his life, but you can't touch him. You can only touch the things about his life." Well, Job was the wealthiest, and he had the cattle, and he had the camels, and he had the oxen, he had the fields, and he had the farms, and he had the servants, and he had all of this going on. He had 7 sons. He had 3 daughters. His life was perfect, and yet Satan began to touch his life, and bandits began to come in, and they began to steal his cattle and his camels and his oxen. They began to destroy his fields. They destroyed his farms, and lastly, they killed his children. And one by one, servants would come to Job, and they would say that these bandits came in and they stole all the oxen, but I alone survived to come and tell you the bad news. And then as he was speaking, another person would come up and say, "Job, you're not going to believe what happened. The raiders fell on us and they destroyed your farm and they killed all your servants, and I alone survived to tell you what happened." And a third and finally a fourth who came and said, "Job, your children have all been killed. That's a really bad day. You go from being the wealthiest person who has amazing kids and everything's going right in his life to being a person who's literally sitting in the ashes of a life that has been burnt down. You have nothing left. You've lost everything in terms of your finances, in terms of your possessions, but even more, you've lost your children. How devastating, how horrific could that be? And when you're in that situation, can you still recognize and acknowledge that God is on the throne? When life is in that place, can you still stop and say, God's still good? Because all of us are going to have those seasons that things don't go well. You're going to have some great days. You're going to have some wonderful days, amazing days. But you're also going to have some really dark days, some painful days. Days that are disaster because of decisions you made. Days that are disaster because of something somebody else did. You're going to have those days. And on those days, can you still worship God? Because here's what Job does. Job chapter 1, verse 20. It says that Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground. And he worshiped. So he does acknowledge the grief and the anxiety. He tears his robe. Now the writer here uses very few words to express Job's grief. But he tears his robe. He shaves his head. And he falls to the ground. And in this worst moment of his life, when most of us would probably either get angry at God or cry out to God and ask why, Job chooses to worship. And he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. We would look at God and ask God, why? Why did you do this? Why did you allow that to happen to me? But Job doesn't do that. And the story gets worse for Job. Because even though Job worships God, Satan goes back to heaven and says that Job is only serving you because you protected him. Doesn't matter that I took everything else. He's still only serving you because you protected him. And God says, well, you can touch his body, but you can't take his life. So Job chapter 2 verse 7 says, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery. This is where Job is. The only thing that Job has left is broken pottery to scrape himself while he sits in the ashes of his life. The only thing left of his life is ashes. His health is gone. Is his wife and breath to breathe. And he sits in ashes, but everything else has been taken from him. And so what do? Verse 9, his wife says to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die? And that's exactly what Satan wanted Job to do. Satan wanted Job to curse God and die, to blame God for everything that's going wrong. And this is what Satan will do to you and me. This is why it's a battle sometimes to worship, because when my life isn't going well, when I've been left alone and I'm hurting and everything seems to be so gloomy, those are the difficult times. And it doesn't even really have to be that difficult of a time for us to find it difficult to worship. Sometimes we're just in a bad mood and we find it difficult to worship. Sometimes everything is going right in our life, but the wrong person treated us wrong. And because the wrong person treated us wrong, we find it difficult to worship. And we get angry and we get frustrated and we shut down. And the enemy is saying, why don't you just curse God? Why don't you just blame God? Why don't you just point your finger at God? Why don't you blame God for everything that's messed up? Because God could have changed this. God could have protected Job. God could have told Satan, no, you can't touch him. He's off limits. God could have. And so Job's wife looks at him and says, curse God and die. Now notice what Job has now lost. He had already lost all of his wealth. He had lost all of his possessions. He had lost the life of his 10 children. He had lost his health. And in this one statement, he has lost the confidence of his wife. There's no lower place to be and still be on this planet than to be sitting in the ashes of what used to be. And here's what Job says. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil? In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job said, I'm going to worship God not because of who I am. I'm going to worship God because of who he is. I'm not going to worship God for what he's done for me. I'm going to worship God for who he is. That's what true worship is. See, here's Job's wife's problem. Job's wife worshiped God for what God had done. She served God for his hand. As long as God was putting out his hand and blessing her, she continued to serve him. But once God withdrew his hand, she lost her relationship with him because her relationship with him was only based on the blessings. And if your worship is only based on God's blessings, then your worship isn't really that true. What true worship is I acknowledge who you are. And I recognize who I am not. And because you are the King of Kings, and because ultimately I am nothing in the grand scheme of things, I worship you for that reason and that reason alone. That's what true worship is. And that's why sometimes it's a fight. Because if it feels like God has pulled his hand back from us, it's difficult to worship. And you want to just say, curse God and die. That's what the enemy is whispering in your ear. And so what is worship? What is worship? Worship is when you and I, from the depths of our heart, begin to acknowledge God just simply for who he is, completely irrespective of who we are. Jesus says this in John 4:23, the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is looking for people to worship him in spirit and truth. And Jesus continues, God is a spirit. And those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. What does this mean for us, this spirit and truth? It means that there has to be this heart worship. When it talks about the spirit that you and I have in our life is the spirit that God has given us, and we must worship him with everything that's in us. And the truth is the acknowledgement of knowing who he is and who we are not and who no one else is. That he and he alone is worthy of our worship. The Apostle Paul wrote it like this in Romans 12:1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. In other words, Paul is saying, I want you to give everything that you are to worshiping God. Like your whole life should be given to that, to acknowledging who he is. We don't serve God because of what God has done for us in terms of blessing us. We serve God because of who he is. And we are thankful for all the blessings. But even if God didn't bless us, if the only thing you and I had was salvation through the cross of Calvary, he'd still be worthy of all the worship that we have, all the worship that we can get. And so when you ask what is worship, worship is just when you acknowledge the reality that he and he alone is God and that we're nowhere near him. We're nothing compared to him. And so then I want to challenge you by looking at different ways that you can worship. And so if you get the notes, I put in there 10 ways that you can worship. These things they're not necessarily worship. They're just expressions of the way that we can worship. Look at Psalms 95:6. Come, let us bow down. Let us worship and bow down. So you can bow without it being worship to God, but you can also choose to use bowing as a way to worship God. And he says, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. We can bow and we can kneel. Paul said this to the church in Ephesus. He said, for this reason I bow my knees to the Father. One of the things I like to do in our Saturday morning, 9 a.m. prayer. We have 9 a.m. prayer every Saturday morning. It's a wonderful worship gathering. If you've never been a part of it, I want to invite you this Saturday, 9 a.m. It's an incredible worship gathering. One of the things I like to do is I like to kneel. I come right down here to the front and I just kneel and I pray, and it's a part of my worship. So you can bow, you can kneel. Revelation chapter 1:17, the Apostle John said, I fell at his feet as though dead. In other words, I just laid prostrate before him. I just stretched myself out to worship him. And so that's a third way that you can worship. You can kneel, you can bow, you can lay prostrate. 1 Timothy, the Apostle Paul, wrote this to his young friend. I desire then in every place that men should pray, lifting holy hands. If you're new to Christianity and you're wondering, why do people raise their hand while the worship is happening? Why do they raise their hand during the songs? It's because it's a type of worship. We're just raising our hands in worship to God as a sign of surrender, saying all of my life belongs to you. That's what it means when you and I raise our hands in worship. So that's another way that you and I can worship. Here's a fifth or sixth way that you can worship. Psalms 47:1. Clap your hands, all you people. Shout to God with loud songs of joy. And so we clap a lot here at First Church. It should never just be something we do. When as a church, as a congregation, we begin to clap, it should be from our heart. That spirit and truth that Jesus was talking about, that's the way we should clap. And so whoever it is, when they walk up here, and they encourage us to do that, don't just do it. Think about what you're doing. Why am I clapping? I'm clapping because I have a great King, a Lord and Savior in heaven who deserves my worship. Psalms 149:3 says, let them praise his name with the dancing. I wish I could dance. I really wish I could. I cannot. It's pitiful, y'all. This body has no rhythm in it. We just stay right here. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You don't go anywhere else with it. Just keep it right there. But dancing is another way that you can worship God. And then it says, making melody with the tambourine and the lyre. Psalms 95:1. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. That's another way that you and I can worship, through singing to the Lord. The key part is making a joyful noise. If it's not joyful, y'all, whisper your singing. Like, verse 2 says, let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. That's another way that you and I can worship, just by talking about the things for which we are thankful. I'm thankful for the wife that God gave me. I'm thankful for the incredible son that he gave me. I'm thankful for my 2 beautiful daughters. I'm thankful for a healthy grandson. I'm thankful for the home that I live in. I'm thankful for the cars that I get to drive. I'm thankful that I was able to sleep in a comfortable bed last night. I'm thankful for the fruit that I ate this morning. That is a way that you and I worship, just rehearsing the things for which we are thankful. In verse 3, he says, declare his glory among the nations. In other words, talk about the good things God has done. Don't just know that God has done good things and don't share it with anyone. If God's been good to you, tell somebody how good God has been good to you. Did God get you through a sickness? Did he get you through a difficult financial time? Did he get you the pay raise or the promotion? Did he get you married to the right person and kept you from marrying the wrong person? Declare his glory among the nations. It's another way that you and I can worship him. Psalms 33 verse 2 says, give thanks to the Lord with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. In verse 3 it says, sing to him a new song and play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. This is talking about worshiping God with musical instruments. So I've shared with you a number of ways that you and I can worship God. We can come into this house during a prayer gathering and we can just kneel before God. You can bow before him. You can come in here and clap your hands. You can sing. You can raise your hands and worship. You can dance. There's so many things that you and I can do to worship him. And there's one more I want to share with you. Proverbs 3:9. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine. The very first time people came to worship God, it was through an act of giving. When you and I come in here to give, we pay our tithe, give offering, it should be with a heart of worship, a heart of thanksgiving. That's how I should give financially. Now, Lanita and I, it's a pattern. We know what we're giving. We're not surprised by what we're going to give. We religiously pay our tithes, but it should never just become something that is a duty and a chore to do. It should always be done with thanksgiving. Why? Because God has been so good to me. And so instead of just doing it, I do it as a heart of worship. That's what Paul means in Romans 12:1 when he says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your spiritual worship. In other words, everything about my life should be worship to God. Everything about my life should be worship. Now, that's a tough one when you think about it, because we think of worship as something we do when we come in here. And it is. When we come in here to sing these songs, that's worship. We clap our hands, that's worship. But everything should be worship. In fact, there's a place in the New Testament that Paul says, make sure everything in your life glorifies God. That means in a few minutes, I'm going to leave this place, and I'm going to go to, if my wife will let me, I'm going to go to Alpaca's and get a quarter dark chicken with some plantains and some yuca. And I'll see some of y'all there. You go with that, baby? All right. How does that glorify God? How does me going to a place like that and eat, how does that glorify God? Because it's based on my attitude. When I sit down at that table, if I have an attitude that is just irritated and annoyed at life, I am bringing displeasure to God. But if I sit down at a table and I am thankful for the food that is sitting in front of me, this is why we bow our heads and pray before we eat. I bow my head to pray, and I didn't share this with the other two services. Third worship gathering always gets something else. When I bow my head to pray, when I eat, I do this every time. I always just, Father, thank you for this food we're about to eat. And I thank you for your blessings. And I thank you for the cross of Calvary. Every single time I pray over my food, I always say that I'm thankful for the cross of Calvary. Because if you set your mind on what God has done for you, and that right there becomes communion. At the end of this worship gathering, we're going to celebrate communion together. But you can have that communion with God every single time you sit down to eat if you have the right attitude. And that's how everything becomes worship. So tomorrow morning when you're driving to work and you're on the mad race up the All-American, and there are people who are driving, they're late, so they're driving like idiots, and you're getting irritated and you're annoyed, your response can be worship. And you are 100% responsible for your decision to allow that to be worship or not to be worship. I wish I could say that it was just, worship was just what it was, but that's not true. Worship is you choosing to worship. It's always 100% your choice. If it was ever forced on you, you'd just be a mechanical human being. But you're not a mechanical human being. You are a person with the freedom to choose to have the right attitude to glorify God. And you're not always going to feel like it. My grandfather would say, well, then your emotion will follow your motion. He said that all the time. In other words, you may not always feel like coming in here and singing songs to God, but you come in here and you think about the words and you go ahead and you sing them because he's worthy. And if you'll do that, you'll begin to feel like it. And you may not always feel like clapping your hands, but if you'll go ahead and clap your hands, you'll begin to feel like it if you'll do it with the right heart. And when you're driving down the road, you may not always feel like blessing the Lord. You might feel like blessing somebody else, if you know what I mean. But if you will bless the Lord instead, then your emotion will begin to follow your emotions. I wonder how many people go to work, and you go to work because you go to work braced, right? You go to work braced because of who the boss is and the culture of the environment, and you go to work braced because of the coworkers and the people you got to work with, and there's all kinds of things that can just cause you to go in there and be shut down. I wonder what would happen if instead of that, if we walked into our workplace and we just had an attitude of worship that said, yeah, my boss may be a little difficult, or the coworkers may be a little annoying, or this may be negative, or that may be pessimistic. All those things might be true. In spite of all those things, I still serve a God who sits in the throne of heaven, so I'm not going to complain. I'm going to talk about the goodness of Jesus Christ. And this is Bible. Now, you've got the story of Job having lost everything, and he says, yet I'm going to worship. But I want to show you another place in the Old Testament, the book of Habakkuk. Now, if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, Habakkuk is just a short little 3-chapter book. It's real short near the end of the Old Testament. And it begins with Habakkuk the prophet complaining to God and God responding. And then after this conversation takes place, this is how Habakkuk ends his book. He says, even though the fig tree doesn't blossom and there's no figs to eat, and there's no fruit on the vines, and even though the produce of the olive fails, there are no olives and there's no dressing from the olives, and the fields yield no food, so we're in famine, and the flock be cut off from the fold, there's no meat left to eat, and there be no herd in the stalls. Habakkuk has identified a time of economic collapse. He's identified a time of famine. It's distress. In other words, everything is wrong. There's nothing right. None of us have ever been to a place like that. There's not one moment in any of our lives where we've been that low. But here's Habakkuk's response. In spite of all that, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Notice what happened there. He said, I will rejoice. And when I rejoice, I will begin to feel joy. In spite of everything that's wrong around me, if I would just go through the motions of rejoicing, then I'll begin to feel the emotion of joy. And this is what you and I have to do. We have to make up our mind. It's our decision. It's my choice. I can be a grumpy, just curmudgeon. I don't know what the right word is. I can be that. I can just be down and out and pessimistic and negative and derogatory. I can be all of those things if I want. That's a choice. But the opposite is to say, oh yeah, I'm not unaware. I haven't put my head in the sand. I know all the things that are wrong in our culture. I know what's going wrong in this situation and that situation. But in spite of all those things, I will rejoice in the Lord and I will experience the joy of the Lord. I'll go through the motions and I'll begin to experience the emotions. And so we don't wait till we feel like it. Because if you only wait till you feel like worshiping Him, you're not going to worship Him very often. Aren't you glad you're not saved only when you feel like you're saved? So even when you don't feel saved and you don't feel like worshiping Him, He's still God. We see this in the New Testament too. Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas were arrested, falsely accused, beaten with a whip, and thrown in jail. And so what did they decide to do? They decided to throw a pity party for themselves. They decided to start talking about how bad everything was and how God wasn't for them. That's what they decided to do. And we know that's not the case because Scripture tells us at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. I want you to see what happened here. Paul and Silas began to change the environment of the prison. Now, if you know the story, they literally changed the environment. Because as they began to worship, an earthquake shook and the gates of the prison fell off their hinges. This is what can happen in your home and in your workplace and all of your life. If instead of us choosing pity, instead of us choosing negativity, instead of us choosing to be miserable and mopey, instead of us choosing that path, if instead we will choose to begin to worship, we will change the environment in which we are living. It's not easy, and it's why the sermon is titled, the battle for worship, because it won't be easy to worship all the time. But if you will worship in that environment, you will change everything that's around you. Imagine how your workplace could be different if your attitude changed. If you walked in there with an attitude of worship. I'm not saying to walk into your work office tomorrow shouting hallelujah. The attitude, it's a heart thing, right? It has to be internally, but it will change everything. And it will cost you because worship costs us something. In fact, the Bible uses this language, Hebrews 13:15. Through Him, through Jesus Christ, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise. And then He says that is the fruit of the lips. How is me verbally talking about God a sacrifice of praise? Because you are making a decision that it's not going to be about me and where I am, but it's going to be about Him. We spend a whole lot of time talking about us. and not nearly enough time talking about him and his goodness. The Apostle Peter wrote it like this: you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. It's that language, spiritual sacrifices. And so all of us should have this mentality that we're going to worship not when it's convenient, but we're going to worship also when it's inconvenient. When it's convenient, but also when it's inconvenient. It may cost me, but I'm still going to worship him. I'm going to worship him when I feel good, and I'm going to worship him when I feel bad. I'm going to worship him when I'm on a high, but I'm going to worship him when I'm on a low. I'm going to worship him when my hands are full, but I'm also going to worship him when my hands are empty. I'm going to worship him when everybody's loving me, but I'm also going to worship him when everyone's not loving me. I'm just going to worship him. Why? Because of who he is, not because of who I am. And I want you to fight this battle. And I fear that this is, and I'm guilty of this. I'm very guilty of this. That this is an area where we very quickly throw in the white flag. We very quickly go from being people who are just excited about worshiping God to being overwhelmed with whatever's happening in our lives. And we can allow it just to get us down and to keep us from worshiping him. But if you will fight that fight, the battle for worship, you will change the environment, the culture in which you are living. This is such an incredible truth. Will you stand to your feet and let's give the Lord a great big hand clap of praise. Will you do it real big? Will you do it real big? There's going to be times when you don't even feel like God knows where you are. And in those times, it's difficult to worship. Job said, I was looking for God. All around me, I was looking for God. I couldn't find him. I looked in front, behind, right, left. I could not find God. But then Job said, but he knew where I was. There's going to be seasons in your life where you don't know where God is. You don't know why he's doing what he's doing. But that's when you have to just trust he knows where you are. And so instead of allowing all of it to get you down, you're just like, you could walk in here and you could be like, God, you know what's going on in my life, and I really don't know why you're allowing it to happen to me. But maybe the most beautiful expression of worship is not the person who comes in with all smiles. The most beautiful expression of worship is the person who's going through hell, and they still come in here and they're just like, Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I love you. Our worship team is going to lead us in worship. Come on up here, guys. They're going to lead us in worship. And I want you to just intentionally get lost. Just you and Jesus. Just get lost in his presence. And over the next few minutes, just focus on him, who he is. Not because he's blessed me, just simply because of who he is. In the name of Jesus.